Good morning, boys and girls. I hope you had a great weekend. Today we are starting a new topic that is telling time to the minute. And on this telling time to the minute, we're going to be looking at different ways to represent time. Let's look at the first problem. Xander and his mother are visiting a store. In the store, there are many clocks on the shelves. The clocks show different times. Tell the times shown on each of the clocks below. So our helper is telling us use structure. Recall that the space between each small tick mark on a clock represents a unit of 1 minute. So when I look at the first clock and I see that remember the hour hand is the shorter hand. The hour hand is pointing directly at the 1, and the minute hand is pointing directly at the 12. Now you may want to get your small ruler that you should have in your toolbox so that you can guide that minute hand or the hour hand at times directly to the number. So we would write the time for the first clock as 1:00. It's 1 o'clock. Let's look at our second clock. Now I look at my hour hand and I can see that my hour hand is between the 5 and the 6. That means that it is after 5, but it is before 6. So I'm going to start my time with my 5, and then I'm going to look at my minute hand, which is directly down at the 6. So we know that at the 6, it's half of an hour, but let's count it by 5s to show that we can count it correctly. Starting with the 12 and going to the 1 would be 5, and then 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. So we know that this clock represents 5:30. Now our next clock, I'm going to always start with my hour hand. I look at my hour hand and I line it up and I see that it is between the 5 and the 6, and actually it's quite close to that 6, but it is not quite there. So my hour hand is still in the 5, and then I'm going to look to see the minutes. Again, I can start from the beginning at the 12 and count by 5s for each of the numbers on the clock. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and our minute hand lands on the 11, which is 55. So the time on this clock is 5:55. Now at the bottom it says Xander and his mother leave the store at 8:47. How can you use the clock to show this time? Well, now we're going to look at our clock, and we know that 8 is going to be between that 8 and that 9 for the hour hand, but that 47 is very important for me to know that there are only 60 minutes in an hour, and 47 is much closer to a new hour than 0 would be. So I know that my shorthand for my 8 is going to be actually closer to my 9. And remember, my shorthand is going to be short. Now, for my long hand, I've got to make it say 47, the long hand being the minute hand. Well, we know we're going to start by counting by 5s. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45. So if it was going to be 45, starting at that center point, I know that my minute hand would be right here, but I know that it's not 45, it's 47. So now I have to count the individual tick marks. So I'm going to move my ruler, 46 and 47. Now I'm going to make sure that I line up my ruler with the dot in the middle to make my long hand point to 47. Let's turn our paper over. Now this clock shows the time a train from Memphis is scheduled to arrive at Central Station. What time is the train scheduled to arrive? That's our question. Write the time in digital form and in 2 other ways. Now, when we look at our little helper, she tells us that analog clocks, which are these, with the numbers and the round circle face, analog clocks are tools that can help you show and tell time to the nearest minute using minute and hour hands. Digital clocks use numbers and symbols to show and tell time. You can also write time using words and numbers. So let's look at step 1, rather like what we just did on the first page. The hour hand is between the 12 and 1. So remember the hour hand is the shorter one? And I can see that it's between 12 and 1. The time is after 12 o'clock and is before 1. So I know that the hour is after 12 but before 1. So therefore I know I'm going to be writing the 12 for my hour hand. Now, in 5 minutes, the minute hand moves from one number to the next, just like we just did. So we can see that they are taking, starting at 12, which is our o'clock, which would be 0, and they're moving forward. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. So 12:40 would be right here. But as you can tell, we're not at 12:40, but this is step 2, counting the 5-minute slots. So we know that the hour is 12 and that the minute hand is after 40. So let's look at step 3. Step 3 tells us to look at the minutes after the 40. In 1 minute, the minute hand will move from one mark to the next. And we can see that we have to count 1, 2 minutes. So therefore, the digital time is 12:42. It is 42 minutes after 12 o'clock. Or we could say that it's 18 minutes before 1. So if I look at here and they're telling us it's 18 minutes, I would be counting the rest of the minutes. It's 1, 2, 3, and then 3 plus 5 is 8. 8 plus 5 is 13, and then 13 plus 5 is 18. 18 minutes before 1 o'clock. Now, to convince me, a train arrives from Atlanta 1 hour after the Memphis train. Write the arrival time of the Atlanta train in digital form and 2 other ways. Use a clock face to help. So if the Memphis train arrived at 12:42, I know that I have to go 1 hour further, which would make our Memphis train now 12:42. So our Atlanta train would not be 12, it would be between the 1 and 2, so it would be 1. And we know that it's exactly an hour, and therefore look, 40, 41, 42, 42, 1:42. This is my digital. Now it tells me to also write it in 2 other ways. So when we looked up here, we saw here's our digital time. Here's a second way to write it. It's 42 minutes after 12. So what is it? It is 42 minutes after, and this time it's after 1 o'clock. That's where so that was in the wrong place. Or we could say how many minutes it is before 2. So remember up here, it told us it was 18 minutes before 2. So now we know that it is 18 minutes. Up here it was 18 minutes before 1. An hour later would make it 18 minutes before 2 o'clock. All right, so let's look at our next page. So, do you understand? Excuse me, the focus messed up when I turned my paper over. So let's get it back to where it should be. Excellent. In the Memphis train example, why is 42 minutes after 12 o'clock the same as 18 minutes before 1 o'clock? Well, we already talked about the fact that we can look at time and tell it two ways. So the first time tells how many minutes after the hour. So the second time tells how many minutes before the next hour. They both are using minutes to describe the same time that occurs between 12 and 1 o'clock. An airplane landed at 3:55. Does the clock show the time the airplane landed? Explain. So they're saying that this clock says 3:55. Well, let's look closely at that hour hand. If it was 3:55, I know that 55 is very close to 60, which there are 60 minutes in an hour, and therefore my hour hand should be quite close to the 4. Is that happening here? It is not. So our answer here is no. The hour hand is pointing at the 3. It should be closer to the 4. So remember, when we get to the 55, it's quite close to that new hour, which would mean that hour hand would need to be really close to that new hour. In number 3 and 4, write the time shown on each clock in two ways. So our first clock, we can look at the hour, and I see that my hour is between the 3 and the 4, and it's really close to 3. So 3 o'clock is my hour, and my minutes. I can start at the 12 and go to the 1. That would be 5, 10, and then I've got to count my tick marks, 11, 12. So 3, 12. What's another way we could write this? We could write it by saying 12 minutes after what? 3 o'clock. Looking at number 4, they're showing us the digital time. That's very similar to what we just wrote for that analog clock on the first one. So when it's already showing us that digital time, it wants us to show the other two ways that we would write this time. We would not use 5:43 because that is the digital time of what it's showing. But what we would write is, we could say it's 43 minutes after 5 o'clock. Well, if it's 5:43, oops, excuse me, let me get my clock to show 5:43. Right there, it says 5:43. Another way that we could write this time is looking at how many minutes is it before the next hour. So sometimes it's easier to start by counting by 5, so we can start here and count back by 5, 5, 10, 15, and then we would count the single minutes, 16, 17. So we could say that it is 17 minutes before which time? Before that new hour of 6 o'clock. So before 6 o'clock. Now let's look down at the bottom, and it's telling us again we're writing the time in two ways for each of these clocks. Now the first one is an analog clock, so automatically I'm going to write basically that digital time. So if I look at my hour hand, I can see that it's between 11 and 12, so my hour is going to be 11, and now I simply have to count my minutes. 5, 10, 15, 20. It's 11, 20. And I could also write this as, oops, I just wrote 12, excuse me. 11, 20. I could also write this as 20 minutes after what? After 11 o'clock. And if I look at number 6, it's giving me the digital time, so I'm going to give them minutes. The first thing I'm going to look at is how many minutes after the hour it is. So it's 39 minutes after 7 o'clock. Now, if it's 39 minutes after 7 o'clock, I need to know the other time would be how many minutes before the new hour. Well, I'm going to make my clock say 7. There's 7, and then I'm going to take it to 39. There's 30, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39. So I can see that it's almost to the 8, the hour hand is, that's tucked behind that minute hand. So I'm going to count backwards from up here. 5, 10, 15, 20, and then one more minute would make it 21. So it's 21 minutes before 8 o'clock. So number 7. What time does it show on number 7? Well, I see, remember that shorthand's the hour hand, that it is between the 8 and the 9. So I know that it's going to be 8, and then I've got to count my minutes. So I know that the hour is 8, and I'm going to make this one come right to the same one. Right there, make it a little bit easier for you to see. And then I can see 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. And then it's not quite on that 45. It's 41, 42, 43, 44. So it's 8:44. Now the other way I can view this is how many minutes before the new hour? Well, if the hour currently is 8, I know that it's going to be how many minutes before 9 o'clock? Start backwards. 5, 10, 15 plus one more minute makes 16. So it's 16 minutes before 9 o'clock. And then finally, we're on the back. Now we're going to go ahead and start with number 10 and watch our time to see if we have time to go back up to our others. Mia left her house at 25 minutes before 3 o'clock. Draw hands on the clock to show when she left. So if it's 25 minutes before 3 o'clock, I know that the hour is between 2 and 3. And if it's 25 minutes before 3, I know that it's past halfway, so it's going to be a little closer to the 3 than the 2. Not a lot closer, but a little closer. So I'm going to find halfway, and then I'm going to kind of come just a tad bit closer. And remember, my hour hand is short. And I'm just going to use a straight line, no arrows. It makes it difficult to see. Now my minutes are 25 minutes before 3 o'clock. So I'm going to start at the 12 and go backwards because it's before 3. So I've got 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. I know that my minute hand needs to be right here on that 7. And so remember that minute hand is nice and long. Remember, a ruler helps us be able to draw our lines so that we can clearly see what the minute hands are showing. Let's go down to number 12. Clay and his family sit down to eat dinner at the time shown on the clock. Which of the following are other ways to write that time? Select all that apply. So we're going to check every single one of these. Well, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to figure out for myself what time does this clock show. And I would look at the hour hand first, and I see that it is before the 6 and right after that 5. So it's between 5 and 6. So I know automatically that the hour hand is the 5. Now I'm going to look at those minutes, and I'm going to count how many minutes after 5 it is. So 5, 10, 15 plus one more makes it 16. I know that the time on the clock is 5:16. Now, I'm going to first look and see, is that time written down here? And there it is. It's 5:16. So what's another way to write this time? Remember, when the minutes are between the 12 and that 6, when those minutes are represented there, we're going to say how many minutes after the hour. So I know another way to look at it would be it's 16 minutes after 5 o'clock. So let's see, do we have that option? Yes, we do. 16 minutes after 5 o'clock. So I already know those are two ways to write it, but let's check the others. This one says that the hour is 3. Well, I know when I look at my clock that the shorthand is well past 3. It's between 5 and 6. I know that cannot be the right time. This one says that it's 44 minutes before 5 o'clock. Well, let's look at that. We already know that the hour hand is between 5 and 6. Is it 44 minutes before? No, not when we already see that it's between the 5 and the 6. It can't be before 5 o'clock because it's already after 5. And then this one says that it's 16 minutes before 5 o'clock. Again, could it be before 5 o'clock? No, because it's already at that 5. So it could not be that. Our only answers are those two right there. And the final question, Mary Ann called her grandmother. She ended the call at the time shown on the clock. Which of the following are not? You got to be very careful to make sure you look at what is it asking you. It's saying which ones are not other ways to write this time on the clock, and select all that apply. So the first thing I'm going to do is figure out what time is the clock showing me. Well, I look at that hour hand. It's between that 3 and that 4, so I know the hour is 3. And I'm going to count my minutes. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, plus one more tick mark means it is 3:46. That is the time shown on this clock. But remember, I'm not looking for the time shown. I'm looking which ones are not the time shown. So I'm going to go ahead and X out the ones that show me what the time really is, because that's not what it's asking me. So I know that it's not going to be that answer. And this says it's 46 minutes after 3 o'clock. That is another way to write 3:46. So I know that this one is not the correct answer. Let's see, 14 minutes before 9 o'clock. Oh no, they've mixed up their hour hand completely. So I know that this is not the correct time, so I'm going to select it. 9:19. Well, we already said that the hour is between that 3 and the 4, so I know it cannot be 9:19. And the final one says 14 minutes before 4 o'clock. Well, that 4 o'clock tells me it could be that because it's between 3 and 4. Let's count those minutes before 4 o'clock to see how many it is. So I've got 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It is 14 minutes before 4 o'clock. So that one cannot be my answer. Now, looking at what our homework is for tonight. Okay, so you need to take out from your packet 14-1 for our homework. And we're actually going to do Let me get my highlighter. We're going to do all of these on the front because you really need to be able to practice telling time. Super important. So 1 through 9 on the front, and then when we turn it over on the back, 10, excuse me, and then 14 and 15. Making sure you're paying close attention. Number 15 is just like the one we just finished, not the time. So make sure you're selecting those carefully. All right, boys and girls, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you tomorrow.